You survived week 1. Great work! With the course being only 4 weeks, we needed to hit the ground running, and you all rose to the challenge. In week 1, you learned about the law and how it relates to education as a whole. In week 2, we're starting to focus on laws that relate to disabilities. If you're in special education, you know about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This law started life as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act and ensures that the students with disabilities are afforded the same educational opportunities as their peers without disabilities. In the 1960s, it was up to the state and local governments to fund services for children with disabilities in the schools, and few teachers were being trained to work with this population. Also, not much research was going on in the field of special education. There just wasn't any funding. Slowly, advocacy groups started speaking up, and small pots of grant money became available to the states to provide some assistance in specialized education of children with disabilities. But it still wasn't enough. Every state spent the money differently, which made services dependent upon the state a child lived in. With the passage of the Education of the Handicapped Act in the 1970s, these pots of grant monies were consolidated under the same federal law instead of leaving the decision-making to the states. Additional money was also allocated to research, so researchers in the field could determine what practices worked best for students with a variety of disabilities. Regional centers were also established, so local school districts had a place to go to get support. In 1972, Park v. Pennsylvania and Mills v. Board of Education of District of Columbia led to changes to the Education of the Handicapped Act. Specifically, states were now required to provide full educational opportunities to students with disabilities, procedural safeguards for these children, and for education to be provided in the least restrictive environment. Inclusiveness in the educational environment was now on the radar for parents, teachers, lawmakers, and most importantly, students with disabilities. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. This act extended the previous law. Before this act was passed, many states had laws that explicitly excluded children with certain types of disabilities from attending public schools. Children who are blind or deaf, or labeled emotionally disturbed or mentally retarded, were denied access to the public schools. This number reached near 1 million children. Many of these children lived in state institutions. Speaking of mental retardation, take a look at ourword.org and the video about Rosa's Law. Retarded has finally become a word we no longer use. I implore you, stop using it. I'm constantly hearing people refer to things as retarded, and I cringe. It is such a degrading term. Okay, back on topic and off the soapbox. With the passing of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, states were mandated to submit a state plan to the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped describing their policies and procedures for educating all students with disabilities. If states could ensure free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities, they could access federal funding based on an annual count of all children served under the law. New Mexico was the only state not to submit a plan, so did not receive this funding. However, the state was later sued by the New Mexico Association for Retarded Citizens because they were not providing appropriate access to education for children with disabilities. So they came around and joined the other states in forming a plan. I've now lived and been involved in the field of special education in 3 states. Each state is different in how they provide services to students with disabilities, even though all states function under the same laws. In 1990, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was born. Within IDEA, we have a zero reject policy. All students with disabilities are eligible for services, regardless of severity. IDEA sets specific guidelines for identification and evaluation. Eligibility and placement cannot be based on a single assessment, and districts must follow specific evaluation timelines. In fact, from parental consent to evaluate to eligibility determination can take no longer than 60 days. Also, reauthorization to IDEA allowed school districts to use the response to intervention process to determine whether or not a child has learning disabilities. All students have the right to a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment, and parent participation is mandated in order to protect the rights of the student. Parents must be provided written notice of meetings within a reasonable amount of time, typically 10 days, and provide consent for evaluation and any changes to their child's educational placement. If a parent feels their child's needs are not being met, they may pursue due process. In due process, an impartial third party hears evidence of the dispute between the school and the student and makes a determination on the case. In 1997, IDEA was reauthorized and really focused on improving the educational achievement of students with disabilities in both the special education and general education curriculum. Measurable goals and objectives were a requirement in the individualized education programs, and the general education teacher became a member of the IEP team. Though now, the IEP team must include parents, the special education teacher, the general education teacher, a district representative who can supervise the special education process and services, an individual who can explain assessment results, and others that the district or parents may request, such as a speech therapist, occupational therapist, physical therapist, assistive technology director, an advocate or attorney, or, especially important, the student. Further, special education students were now included in district and statewide assessments with the necessary accommodations and modifications made to these tests. In regard to discipline, positive behavioral interventions, supports, and strategies became mandated for students who engaged in problem behaviors. For these students, a functional behavior assessment is required, and an individualized behavior intervention plan must be included in the student's IEP. If the school changes the placement of the student, meaning the student is now spending more time outside of the general education setting, a functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plan implementation must occur within 10 days of the placement change. If a student with a disability is suspended for 10 days, a manifestation determination meeting must be held. At this meeting, the student's IEP team must determine if there's a relationship between the behaviors that led to the suspension and the disability. If there is a relationship, the district cannot continue to suspend the student to address the behavior. Rather, the district must have a behavior plan in place. If there's no relationship between the behavior and the disability, the student is subject to the same discipline procedures as the rest of the students. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was proposed as an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a major effort to protect individuals with disabilities from discrimination. When people think of discrimination, they rarely think of disability, as other categories of discrimination come into mind, such as race, religion, or sexual orientation. However, the sheer number of laws written to protect individuals with disabilities should paint a picture of the struggles these individuals and their families and friends have faced. Please watch the Power of 504 video on Blackboard. It's an award-winning documentary that really demonstrates the effect of discrimination on individuals with disabilities. Section 504 prevents discrimination in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. This includes public schools and universities. Individuals who are protected under this law are any person who has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of such person's major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Under Section 504, a mental impairment includes intellectual disabilities, mental illness, organic brain syndrome, and learning disabilities. Students frequently served under Section 504 are diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities such as dyslexia, physical impairments, medical impairments such as diabetes, and mental illness such as depression or anxiety. In elementary and secondary schools, students are provided accommodations in the general education setting without having an IEP. As mentioned in Unit 1, it's about equity. Section 4 levels the playing field so students can be successful. In post-secondary settings, such as universities and vocational schools, individuals can receive accommodations according to their specific needs related to the disability. I love that this law applies beyond the K-12 career. This might mean physical accommodations, such as accessible classrooms, desks, tables, or equipment. However, this might also mean educational accommodations, such as extended time, the ability to record lectures, or excused absences. I highly recommend taking a look at Table 5.2 in your text. It offers a fantastic comparison between IDEA and Section 504. Chapter 6 covers the Americans with Disabilities Act. You might not realize that this act is younger than IDEA and Section 504. It was passed in 1990 and signed into law by President George Bush. I've included a video of the signing of that bill into law. This was the largest signing ceremony at the White House in history. That speaks to the sheer number of people in this country affected by disabilities. ADA mandates protection for individuals with disabilities against discrimination in both the public and private sector. It focuses heavily on employment and public services. According to the June 2016 Disability Employment Statistics for ages 16 years and over, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is 12.1%, whereas the unemployment rate for people without disabilities is 4.8%. ADA prevents individuals from denying jobs to people with disabilities. In fact, employers must provide reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. Related to ADA, I highly recommend watching the movie Music Within. I'm offering you all an extra credit opportunity. If you are able to come, I'm going to show the movie on one of the campuses on August 10th, the last day of class, at 5 o'clock p.m. I've chosen this time because most of the students who responded to my survey said they could make it at this time. If you come and watch it, you'll get 20 points. I think it will be a good time. I'll even feed you. If you can't attend, rent the movie and write a one-page blog reflection. You must submit this reflection by August 10th at 11:59 p.m. You can rent Music Within on Amazon for $2.99. Okay, FAPE. FAPE is an acronym for Free and Appropriate Public Education. When you say it, it sounds like a no-brainer. Of course students should have access to FAPE. They do now because it's the law, but that wasn't always the case. It floored me to learn that in the early 1970s, only 20% of students with disabilities attended public schools. Those who attended public schools, though, were not receiving an appropriate education. FAPE is a huge part of IDEA. IDEA defines it as special education and related services that are provided at public expense, under public supervision and direction, and without charge, meet standards for the state educational agency, include an appropriate preschool, elementary, or secondary school education in the state involved, and are provided in conformity with the Individualized Education Program. The IEP is a huge component of FAPE. A lot goes into the development of an IEP. First, there's the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, the PLAFP. This is a detailed statement related to what the student can and cannot do. The PLAFP guides the entire document. It talks about what academic, behavioral, social, and functional gains the student has made and what still needs to be achieved. These continuing needs guide the goal writing process. The IEP also includes goals and sometimes objectives. Goals must be specific, measurable, and attainable. Within the goals, you must explain how it will be measured. Are you using permanent product measurement biweekly? Are you collecting interval data or using a behavior report card to measure that behavior goal? Are you using a running record weekly to measure reading progress? If you plan ahead for measurement, you're more likely to follow through with collecting the data. When I taught, I made my data sheets or data binders prior to the IEP meeting. That way, I could show parents how I was taking data and have it ready to go as soon as that IEP went live. Within the IEP must also be a statement specifying the related and supplementary services provided to the student, along with the frequency, duration, and location of these services. Does the child get a one-on-one professional during reading instruction? Does he or she have speech therapy twice a week for 30 minutes? Does the occupational therapist provide consult services to the teacher? Accommodation and modifications must also be considered and recorded. These should reflect what the student needs to receive equitable access to the curriculum. Accommodations on state assessments must also be outlined. Yes, students get accommodations on the state assessments. Finally, the IEP must detail how often progress will be provided to parents. By law, districts must send home IEP progress at least as often as it does progress reports for the general education population. This typically means quarterly. However, it is within the parents' rights to request IEP progress be sent home more often. As you read Chapter 8 in your text, I want you to really take a look at that Raleigh case. Read not only the Yell, Katsianis, and Hazelcorn article written in 2007, but also the Raleigh 2008 article. The Yell article looks at the case from a researcher lens. That's a good lens. I like that lens. It keeps a roof over my head. But I like the Raleigh article better. Amy Raleigh, who was the child in the center of the Raleigh case, wrote a reflection on that case and how it affected her. I think this is a truly powerful article. As adults, it's easy to think about ourselves. It's easy to evaluate how we feel, what we feel is right from wrong. It's not easy to feel what the students in the center of the conflict feel. We should be in this for the children. We should not be in it for ourselves. Involve parents as full partners in the IEP process. As a teacher, your focus is on every student on your caseload. You're busy. You're juggling a lot. It's easy to get sucked into providing services that are okay for everyone. But the parent lives with the child. Their child is their primary concern. Parents know nuances of their child that you might not recognize. Listen to them. Honor their concerns and implement the recommendations whenever possible. Not only is it paramount ensuring students are receiving the best education possible, it's the law. Make sure you read that Conroy, Yell, Katsianis, and Collins article from 2010. It talks about the rights that parents have under IDEA. Principals, teachers, and staff should receive specialized training for working with children with disabilities and their families. Without training and evidence-based practices, these practices won't be implemented with high fidelity. This is a breach of faith. If the interventions aren't evidence-based, they're not appropriate. Take care and pride in developing those IEPs. The I in IEP stands for individualized. Goals should be student-specific, not class-specific. PLAFs should paint a picture of what a student can do and needs additional support with. Accommodations, modifications, and related services need to be determined based on need, not availability. My stepson was given a communication device that was different from what his assessment said was appropriate because it's what the school had available. That's not providing FAPE. Finally, students should have access to the general education curriculum in the least restrictive environment. It's not about what's easiest for schools and teachers. It's about what's best for children. I implore that you keep this in mind at all times. The field is so rewarding. You can change so many lives. We have come so far in 50 years for individuals with disabilities, but we can go so much further. As pointed out by Conroy and colleagues in 2010 and Zirkle in 2013, IDEA has outgrown the cases brought before the court in the past, such as the Raleigh decision. We don't have a definition for the A in FAPE, appropriate. We don't have specific guidelines related to behavior intervention plans. There's so many things we still need to do. Gandhi said, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." You can be that change. Go forth. Be the change.